Okay, let's jump right in. We are starting today with a question that really defines the economic landscape for the entire next generation.
It's a huge question.
It is. And it's one that honestly impacts every single one of us. We're talking policymakers, parents, and of course, every young person out there just trying to, figure out their path in this wildly unstable global economy.
And that core question, which we're pulling from the sources for this deep dive, is really this. What does it actually mean to be young in a world where just finding stable work feels more and more precarious?
Right.
And where the very institutions that are supposed to help you, your schools, your governments, even big companies, often seem better at, well, reproducing exclusion than offering any real sustainable path forward.
That is such a powerful and frankly a pretty grim premise. It comes from the book that's guiding our deep dive today, which is Youth and Employment: Creating a Productive and Dynamic Society. It's by Yasuke Uchiyama and Fumitaka Furuoka.
And this isn't just some abstract economic debate for them. The authors frame this precarity, this instability, as a deep systemic crisis of generational stability. It's a really big deal.
It is. So our mission today is to really unpack the structural forces behind all of this. We're talking economic, institutional, technological forces that have made youth employment so fragile.
Precisely. And we're going to focus on how two massive forces are tangled up together. First, you have the rise of platform capitalism, this whole digital regime that mediates our labor now.
The gig economy.
The gig economy, exactly. And second, you have this deep-seated institutional exclusion that you find in traditional labor markets and even, in our education systems. These problems aren't just incidental. They're fundamental systemic conditions that are going to need a pretty radical response.
And we are going to take a really rigorous path through their research today, which is what we love to do here. We'll start way up at the, let's call it the theoretical stratosphere, looking at macro-level economic models. Specifically, we're going to test whether a really influential and maybe even a comforting economic idea called the law of one unemployment rate, or LOUR, actually holds up when you look at the hard data.
And a little spoiler alert for you.
Yeah.
The results, especially for young people, are genuinely disturbing.
After we establish that empirical proof, that structural disadvantage, we're going to move straight to the micro-level realities.
We're drawing on some incredible empirical depth from the gig economy in Southeast Asia. We'll contrast the intense day-to-day precarity of, say, low-end delivery riders in Malaysia with the almost psychological vulnerabilities of high-skilled online freelancers over in Thailand.
Which just goes to show this problem isn't just about low-skilled work. It spans the entire spectrum.
The whole spectrum, and that's critical.
And finally, we're not just going to leave you with a massive, depressing problem. We're going to synthesize all of that analysis and evidence into a really radical, holistic solution they propose. It's a framework they call the neo-apprenticeship scheme.
And this model is explicitly designed for the digital age, to train autonomous value-creating workers. So this deep dive, it really does affect everyone, whether you're a delivery rider depending on an app for your next paycheck, or a high-skilled online consultant trying to navigate the world of project bids.
The central idea that the authors really keep coming back to is that this crisis, this persistence of precarity for young people, is completely tied up with these huge transformations in the state, in corporations, and in how we even define and value education.
Exactly. The old safety nets were just designed for a totally different economic era. We need new institutional forms to deal with this new reality.
Okay, let's start digging into that structural problem then. And we have to begin with the cold, hard data that really establishes why this is so urgent in the first place.
Right.
When you look at the United States labor statistics, the persistence of high youth unemployment is it's glaring. It absolutely demands an explanation.
It really does. The source material pulls data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, specifically from 2022 to 2024. And if you isolate youth unemployment, so we're talking about ages 60 to 24, the mean unemployment rate over that period was 8.3%.
8.3%. And you have to contrast that with the total mean unemployment rate for everyone, which was only 3.7% in that same period.
Right.
I mean, the severity of the challenge just jumps off the page right there. Young workers are facing unemployment at more than double the national average.
And it's not just double the average. That rate puts them in the highest unemployment group right after workers with disabilities, who are at 7.4%. To give you even more context, women's unemployment was only 3.6% in that time frame.
So this huge persistent gap between youth unemployment and everyone else's, it signals a massive structural fault line. It's not something you can just explain away as, a blip in the business cycle.
It's not a blip.
So the question becomes, how do we explain this persistence theoretically? And the authors, they don't start by inventing new theories. They go straight to the foundational, um, the canonical labor market model, the Mortensen-Pissarides model, or MP model.
Okay, the MP model.
Yeah,
They're using a specific version of it, right? One that's extended to account for disadvantaged workers.
exactly. The MP model, at its core, it helps us understand how the labor market functions, the dynamics of job creation and job destruction. But when you extend it to look at young workers, you have to introduce this key concept called the procyclical assumption.
Procyclical.
And this is absolutely crucial for understanding why youth employment is just inherently so fragile.
The word procyclical makes it sound like whatever the general economy is doing, the effect is just amplified for young people.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's amplified. The procyclical assumption illustrates this really grim reality. Young workers are caught in a systemic double bind.
The double bind.
Yes, they carry the risk of being the first to be fired when the economy goes into a downturn because they have less experience, less company-specific knowledge built up.
Precisely. And then, on the other side of the cycle, they're the last to be hired when the recovery starts, because firms will always prefer more experienced workers when things start looking up again.
That makes so much sense intuitively. If a company has to cut cost, you're going to let go of the newest, least trained employee first. So how do the authors actually capture this dynamic inside the economic model mathematically?
Well, theoretically, this is captured by assigning young workers, let's call them group young, statistically higher job destruction rate. We'll call that rate lambda. So lambda for young people, lambda is greater than lambda for prime-aged workers, lambda.
So if lambda is basically the probability of your job disappearing, you're saying the model bakes in the idea that young workers just carry a higher risk score for the company.
It's a great analogy. They transition from being employed to unemployed much more easily at the slightest hint of an economic shock. And this fragility, it isn't just about a lack of experience. The model connects this directly to the fundamental driver of capitalism.
Which is the zero profit condition.
The zero profit condition. It sounds a bit technical, but it is the absolute heart of a firm's decision-making process.
It's the logic that drives everything.
Everything. The condition basically states that the fundamental logic of business is maximizing surplus value. Or, to put it more simply, it's the capitalist drive of buying to sell dearer. Every single hiring decision is weighed against its potential to maximize profit.
So walk me through how that drive translates into a bias against younger workers.
Well, in this context, employers are just deeply reluctant to hire young people because these new entrants often lack what they call the useful knowledge and desirable skills that immediately translate into high-value creation.
They're seen as a cost center, not a profit center, at least initially.
Exactly. If a young worker is seen as someone who needs substantial, costly training and therefore isn't going to contribute to that surplus value maximization right away, the employer simply won't provide enough job opportunities for them. It's a rational business decision under this model.
So the systemic issue isn't that young people don't want to work. It's that the entire incentive structure, the business cycle, combined with this profit-maximizing logic, means the market rationally decides it's not worth investing in them. It's a structural denial of opportunity.
Which is precisely why we see these high youth unemployment rates sticking around even when the economy is relatively stable. But now this long-standing problem is being violently exacerbated by the rise of platform capitalism.
Platform capitalism. Okay, this is where the old rules of exploitation meet these new digital middlemen, and it just accelerates the whole precarity problem.
It pours fuel on the fire. Platform capitalism, as is defined in the source material, is a specific kind of accumulation regime. It uses all this digital technology and our networks to extract economic value by mediating services, data, and labor.
It's like neoliberal capitalism 2.0.
It's an evolution of it, yeah. And it has its own unique, and I should say, highly efficient exploitative structure.
What are the two main features of this new digital economy that are so damaging for a young worker?
Okay, so first, the gig workers themselves are positioned as the main contributors to profit. They're the ones doing the actual labor that the platform mediates and controls.
Right.
Second, and this is the really critical innovation for the company, the platform owners bear the absolute least amount of risk in the whole transaction. They shift the maximum exposure onto the individual worker.
So it's maximum control over the work with minimum responsibility for the worker.
That is the core mechanism of exclusion. The platform owners, they control the algorithms, the data, the metrics. They effectively commodify the labor power of these gig workers at the lowest possible cost. And the critical institutional move they make is classifying these workers as independent contractors.
And that legal classification, that's the loophole. That's what instantly strips them of all the fundamental rights that traditional employees fought for decades to win.
All of them, they're deprived of minimum wage guarantees, sick leave, paid holidays, and all the crucial social protections, just because they're not legally considered regular employees.
Mm.
And the platforms weaponize this. They combine this institutional exclusion with really sophisticated algorithmic management to control, to stratify, and to encourage this fierce internal competition among the workers themselves.
You know, the source material has this really powerful way of reframing how these platforms operate. The common story is that they're disruptors, that they're just ignoring regulation. But the authors define them as strategically embedded actors.
This is such a crucial high-level insight. It means they aren't just operating outside the law, they're operating from within the institutional framework, and they are actively shaping it to their benefit.
So what does strategically embedded mean in practice?
It means they spend a tremendous amount of money on lobbying and legal resources to reconfigure existing regulations, whether it's rules about urban mobility, communication, data privacy, you name it, to align perfectly with their profit-maximizing logic.
Wait, so they're not just breaking the rules, they are actively rewriting the rule book from the inside. How does that actually work? Do they lobby for specific kinds of ambiguity in the law?
They absolutely do. They exploit institutional ambiguity, especially around the legal definition of a worker, to boost their competitive position and drive down labor costs. They pressure governments to keep the definition of a contractor as loose as possible.
Which allows them to externalize all those cost training, insurance, Social Security onto the individual and the state.
Exactly. In effect, they get to leverage our public infrastructure, our roads, our internet networks, while completely avoiding public responsibility for the labor force that uses it.
That is such a powerful connection between the macro theory of precarity and the micro reality of platform control. They use the system's legal weaknesses to make sure that the young worker, who is already fragile because of that pro-cyclical structure we talked about, remains low cost for the company and high risk for the individual. It just intensifies everything.
And now that we've laid out that theoretical framework, we have to see if the reality of unemployment patterns actually matches up with what classical economics would expect. And this whole idea that unemployment problems are uniform across different groups is summed up and challenged by this concept, the law of one unemployment rate, or LUR.
Okay, LOR. Let's set up this really complex empirical test for everyone listening. So the LOR is a hypothesis, and it basically rests on two big assumptions about unemployment rates among different demographic groups like age, gender, or disability status.
Right. Assumption number one is uniformity. This idea says that the economic forces that drive unemployment, the shocks, the recoveries, should affect all groups in a uniform way.
And assumption number two.
Assumption number two is non-persistence. This one says that any gaps that open up in unemployment, like the gap between young and older workers, shouldn't be permanent. They should close or converge back to some normal level over time.
And the research here is really impressive. They don't just use simple averages. They run this highly sophisticated empirical test on U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics data, and it's segmented so finely by age and disability status. They're using advanced econometric tools, things like ADF-type unit root tests and KPSS-type stationarity tests. The rigor here is what makes it so compelling.
Let's focus on that first assumption, uniformity. The core concept to grasp here is the difference between a stationary process and a unit root process. This is really the key to determining whether an unemployment rate recovers naturally after a crisis or if the shock causes permanent damage.
Okay, let's break down the intuition behind those two terms because they are absolutely critical to understanding the findings.
Think of it this way. If an unemployment rate is a stationary process, it has what economists call mean reversion. Imagine a rubber band. You stretch it when the economy dips, but once the pressure is released, the unemployment rate tends to snap back to its long-run average, or a natural rate.
So these workers bounce back, the shock is temporary, and the system kind of fixes itself.
Exactly. That aligns with the natural rate hypothesis. These workers, typically, they recover pretty quickly without permanent damage to their career path.
Okay, so that's a stationary process. What about the unit root? That sounds not good.
It's not good. A unit root process signals the exact opposite. no mean reversion. If a group's unemployment rate is a unit root process, they suffer from what we call prolonged unemployment or hysteresis after a crisis.
Hysteresis.
Yeah. And in this case, imagine that rubber band doesn't just stretch, it snaps completely. The shock causes a permanent change in the trend. The unemployment rate for that group will not resolve naturally, even if the general economy recovers. This leaves permanent scarring on that group's job prospects.
And why should you, the listener, care about the difference between stationary and unit root? Because it's the difference between a recession costing a young person 6 months of tough job hunting or 6 years of permanent career damage that tanks their lifetime earnings. So the big question is, do young workers fall into that mean reversion category or the permanent damage one?
Let's look at the data. The findings for prime-aged and older workers, so ages 25 to 64, with or without disabilities, were overwhelmingly consistent and predictable.
They were stationary.
Their unemployment rates are stationary. Specifically, 6 out of 8 different statistical tests they ran all pointed to stationarity for these groups. They have that expected mean reversion, they're resilient, they bounce back.
That confirms the classical view of the labor market for experienced workers. So what about the young workers?
Here we have to split them into 2 groups. For the slightly older youth, so ages 20 to 24, the majority of tests, 5 out of 8, indicated a stationary process. So the conclusion there is a little indecisive, but it definitely leans towards stationarity.
Okay, so they're vulnerable, but they mostly recover.
They mostly recover, perhaps because they've had more time to invest in education and skills. But the real shock to the system, the real deviation, appears in the youngest group. The teenagers just trying to get their first foothold in the labor market.
What did the data say about them?
Teenage workers, aged 16 to 19, showed a stark and really troubling divergence. Specifically, teenage workers without disabilities were found to be, generally, a unit root process. A staggering 6 out of 8 of these sophisticated statistical tests indicated a unit root for this group.
6 out of 8, that is a huge finding. It means that for this group, for teenagers, the effects of a crisis are not temporary. They suffer from prolonged, persistent unemployment. Their rate does not just snap back to normal after a crisis. This completely shatters that first assumption of Elor, the idea of uniformity.
It absolutely does. The lack of mean reversion in teenage unemployment directly contradicts it. We have empirical proof that unemployment patterns are demonstrably not uniform. The system fails to restore equilibrium for its youngest, most vulnerable workers.
Okay, so uniformity is out. The economic system is permanently scarring them. So let's move to that second assumption, non-persistence. This is testing whether the unemployment gap between young and older workers closes over time.
Right. We define the age unemployment gap as the difference between youth workers and older workers. If a Lauer holds, this gap should converge, it should shrink over time. If it doesn't, that's what we call persistence, and it means that structural disadvantage is locked in place.
So what did the findings show? Did the gaps converge?
The findings were overwhelmingly non-convergent. They showed severe persistence in the age unemployment gap. Non-convergence was found in the vast majority, 12 out of the 16 different gaps they tested. This is the structural proof that this disadvantage doesn't just fade away as a young worker gets older.
Let's get specific. Where is this persistence most severe? Because that tells us where intervention is most needed.
Persistence was consistently found across several vulnerable groups. Specifically, there was overwhelming non-convergence in all 4 age gaps for teenage workers with disabilities, all 4 age gaps for young workers with disabilities, and all 4 age gaps for young workers without disabilities.
So basically, every category of young worker is facing an age-related disadvantage that the market simply fails to fix on its own over time.
That's right. The only tiny glimmer of convergence was in a few specific tests, but even those were largely contested by the newer, more sophisticated statistical tools the authors used. The overall conclusion is just undeniable.
The persistent age unemployment gap violates the second assumption of Elor.
Completely. The data strongly suggests youth workers are structurally disadvantaged, and their employment challenges are chronic, not cyclical. The scarring is permanent.
That realization that permanent scarring is happening to the youngest members of the labor force is it's genuinely bleak. It runs completely contrary to the general expectation that this age gap should shrink as the economy improves.
And that persistence points to a crucial, non-negotiable takeaway. There is an urgent and demonstrated need for targeted active labor market policies, or ALMPs.
You can't just wait for the tide to rise and lift all boats.
No. Simply waiting for the business cycle to recover will not solve the problem for these young workers. If the age gap persists, it means the economic shock leaves behind permanent structural damage that requires systematic institutional repair.
And that evidence of structural disadvantage is the perfect bridge to our next section. We're going to shift now from this. Let's start with case study one, low-end gig work in Malaysia. So we're talking about e-hailing, like ride-hailing, and p-hailing, which is food and goods delivery.
This type of on-demand app work has become the primary shock absorber for youth employment in developing countries. It's filling the gap left by the decline of traditional manufacturing. And the scale is just staggering. The source material estimates that over 90% of delivery workers in Malaysia are young people.
Over 90%?
Yes. By 2020, gig work was contributing to 40% of the livelihoods of poor people in the country. This is not a side hustle. This is the main job for a huge portion of the youth population.
And the authors detailed interviews with 55 young Malaysian workers, which revealed this deep tension between the promised flexibility and the grinding reality of their precarity.
The central daily challenge they all face is algorithmic governance. The workers reported that the system of ratings and rankings imposed by the platform has a direct, minute-by-minute impact on their income, their job assignments, their whole sense of security. The algorithm controls everything.
I can't imagine the psychological stress of knowing your entire livelihood is constantly being judged by this invisible digital mechanism, and it's enforced by immediate customer feedback.
It forces them into intense emotional labor. One driver, identified as G11, told this specific story about dealing with a customer who deliberately put in the wrong delivery location.
Oh, wow.
And instead of arguing or demanding fair pay for the extra travel, the driver felt he had to be excessively courteous and just eat the cost of the lost time and petrol, all because he was paralyzed by the fear of getting a negative rating.
And one bad rating can completely derail your week.
Exactly. Even a 4-star instead of a 5-star could mean fewer job assignments and a tangible drop in your weekly earnings. It's a brutal mechanism of control that turns every customer interaction into this kind of involuntary self-policing, all just to maintain an acceptable score for the algorithm.
And what does all that instability do to their long-term prospects?
It creates a profound lack of future stability. The inherent instability of their earnings, the fact that tomorrow's income is never guaranteed, it makes any kind of long-term planning extremely difficult. Respondents talked about their deep concerns about being able to get a loan or buy a home or even plan for marriage and kids.
This isn't just a labor problem, then. It actively stops them from achieving social independence.
And it's all compounded by the institutional void they're operating in. They lack social protection, clear labor rights, income security. And even though the Malaysian government has a minimal social insurance scheme called Seno CSO, the source material noted that a huge portion of these gig workers aren't even enrolled. They are functionally outside the entire traditional welfare safety net.
But despite that atomization and that algorithmic control, there have been moments of real collective resistance.
Yes, the food delivery blackouts in Malaysia in 2022 and 2024 are critical examples of political organization. These were largely orchestrated through social media, led by new associations, and they were targeting unilateral actions by the platforms. Specifically, sudden base rate cuts and changes to bonus structures by big players like Grab and Foodpanda.
So it shows the workers have agency, they understand their power, even if it's limited.
The effort is there for sure. The work is becoming politicized, and they're pushing for dignity and fairness. However, the influence of these strikes was, at the end of the day, pretty limited. The majority of drivers who weren't affiliated with the associations, especially in rural areas, they often just disregarded the strikes.
Which highlights the severe limitations of trying to organize when you don't have formal institutional backing.
Right. The platforms leverage that lack of unity to minimize their losses during a strike.
Okay, now let's pivot to the other end of the spectrum. Case study 2, high-end gig work in Thailand. Here we're talking about crowd work and online freelancing, highly skilled professionals who you'd think would have more market power.
This study focused on qualitative interviews with 9 skilled young freelancers in Bangkok, ages 24 to 34. These are people like language tutors, web designers, accountants, professionals executing project-based microtasks through digital platforms.
And unlike the Malaysian delivery riders who are often doing it out of necessity, these workers are often defining a kind of hybrid career path.
They are. Many were part-time, choosing this arrangement specifically to balance family or a full-time job, or just because they value flexible time management. Their careers are much more fluid, moving beyond that traditional idea of stable employment. They become these reflexive specialists, always integrating new skills.
And the core value proposition for this high-end group is autonomy. That's the big trade-off. Freedom versus vulnerability.
Participants really valued the flexibility and autonomy. They were actively using gig work for their own long-term career development, internalizing skills, building these multidisciplinary careers without relying on a traditional corporate training program.
But that freedom is still deeply entangled with vulnerability, isn't it? Just like their low-skilled counterparts.
Absolutely. The structural constraints follow them. They face the exact same institutional barriers, that strict legal dichotomy between employee and independent contractor. Even with high skills, this lack of legal status results in unstable pay, chronic late payments from clients, and intense psychological stress from constant performance-based evaluations.
And for a high-skilled professional, what does that psychological stress look like beyond just chasing down payments?
It manifests as acute occupational loneliness and psychological exhaustion. It comes from isolated work environments and that constant performance scrutiny. And even though some of them earned high wages, one accountant was making 70,000 Thai baht a month, they still had severely limited access to Social Security. They have to bear the entire burden of paying for their own health and pension insurance.
Which is especially difficult in the early stages of a career when you need that cash flow just to get stable.
Precisely. So whether you're delivering food on a motorbike in Malaysia or designing a website from a cafe in Bangkok, the underlying structural vulnerability is remarkably similar. It's driven by institutional inadequacy and the platform model's genius for externalizing risk.
And what about collective action on the high-end side?
Well, the conclusion there is equally troubling. There is very little organized movement toward collective bargaining. There's a tendency to just rely on your own individual market power or wait for the government to step in and regulate.
So the source material emphasizes the need to foster that collective power somehow.
Urgently. Perhaps through professional associations outside the platforms themselves, just to give these highly skilled but atomized workers a collective voice to counter the information asymmetry and the dominance of the platforms.
It's just so clear from both the statistics and these real-world stories that the current setup is failing young people across the entire skill spectrum. It's transforming promised flexibility into entrenched vulnerability. We desperately need a radical, systematic rethink of the whole connection between education, work, and institutional recognition.
And this persistent failure of the current system, both the outdated labor market structure and the inadequate social institutions, brings us to the solution proposed by Uchiyama and Furuoka, the neo-apprenticeship scheme.
The core problem they're targeting is this huge education practice disconnect. Our traditional education system just fails to equip young people with the adaptive skills they need for platform capitalism. And on the flip side, gig work itself, it rarely provides any systematic training or structured learning.
And that absence of structured learning is what really perpetuates the precarity. So to bridge this gap, the authors constructed this holistic learning framework. It's designed to transform young people from being passive recipients of instruction into autonomous agents who actively create economic and social value. They call them a value creator, or using the Esperanto term, the valokrinto.
This framework is a really fascinating intellectual synthesis. It pulls together two major and pretty distinct theoretical models from very different cultural contexts.
Yes. It synthesizes Eiichi Kajita's taxonomy of educational goals, which is rooted in these Buddhist concepts of Kaiji Gonyu, that's opening, showing, awakening, and entering.
Okay.
And it combines that with Ikujiro Nonaka's Sessi-Tai model of knowledge creation, which is all about dynamic business practice. The whole goal is to make the entire learning journey visible, recognizable, and valued in this new digital ecosystem.
All right, this is the heart of the solution, so let's walk through the 4 phases of this new apprenticeship scheme nice and slowly. What does that first phase, Kai, or opening, really entail?
Phase 1. Opening, Kai socialization preparation. Katie stresses that this is maybe the most important phase, not for skills, but for emotional and mental readiness. The goal is the institutional guarantee of initial contact opportunities.
So getting your foot in the door.
Exactly. Firms are seen as these storehouses of knowledge, but young workers must first be guaranteed access, maybe through mandatory internships or government-subsidized first jobs.
So Kai is about getting physical access, but also developing the right attitude, the right mental framework for learning.
Precisely. The focus is twofold. First, the young person needs to systematize the personal, tacit knowledge they already have, their life experience, to make it visible and useful. And second, and this is critical, they have to cultivate a robust growth mindset. They need the conviction that sustained, self-directed learning is even possible.
Without that guaranteed access and that mindset, any later learning is just going to be superficial.
It'll be easily abandoned. And in terms of policy, a key suggestion here is implementing structured job search and placement programs, something like the UK's New Deal for Young People Gateway program, which guaranteed an initial work experience or training opportunity. It's about providing the institutional scaffolding for that initial phase and self-discovery.
So once the door is open and the mindset is there, we move to phase two, showing.
Phase 2, showing G externalization novo learnanto. In this phase, the young worker becomes the novo learnanto, or novice learner. This corresponds to the initial socialization phase of Nonaka's SECI model. The process involves structured on-the-job training, or OJT, where senior staff share their personal, embedded, tacit knowledge.
And we established earlier that sharing tacit knowledge isn't like lecturing from a textbook, it's experiential. It's about doing.
Right. Language alone just isn't enough to transfer that kind of knowledge, which includes all the implicit rules, ingrained skills, and even the embedded emotions you need to do a job well. It has to be transferred through imitation and physical communal acts through shared experience and observation.
So like a senior web developer pairing with a novice, letting them watch the nuances of debugging in real time.
Exactly. The mentor's role is to guide the novice by working side by side, creating this experiential field of shared knowledge.
For policymakers who are trying to tackle high youth unemployment, this phase seems to demand some significant financial support for the employers who take on that training burden.
It absolutely does. This points to the need for robust wage subsidy schemes and subsidized employment programs like Jordan's NW program for young female graduates that are specifically designed to facilitate meaningful OJT. The key is to make sure the young person is gaining valuable skills, not just being used as cheap disposable labor.
Okay, moving on to phase three, awakening, or go. This sounds like the point where the learner shifts from just imitating to actually creating things on their own.
Phase 3. Awakening, go combination functionatis virtulo. This is the core knowledge creation stage. It's about transforming the novice learner into a functionatis virtulo, an operational specialist who can create new knowledge independently and systematically. This phase covers the other three modes of the SECI model: externalization, combination, and internalization.
Let's look at externalization again, because this is that crucial step where a personal skill becomes objective knowledge that can be shared.
Externalization is all about converting that deep, personal tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge, knowledge you can write down, teach, and share. And this is where metaphors and analogies become really crucial tools for the specialists.
The metaphor.
Yeah. The source material uses the metaphor of the Lotus Sutra. The Buddha used the lotus flower, which actually bears fruit before it blooms, to explain the simultaneity of cause and effect. New creative ideas often seem counterintuitive or contradictory at first, and a good metaphor provides the intellectual structure to reconcile those contradictions and turn a complex tacit skill into a definable, explicit knowledge system.
So the functionatis spiritulo can not only do the job, but they can now write the manual for the next person, and then they move to combination.
Combination is where they create new explicit knowledge by systematically sorting, combining, and recontextualizing all the existing explicit knowledge they can find, manuals, research papers, data, and assembling it into a coherent new model or a new solution.
And finally, that new explicit knowledge has to become second nature. It has to be internalized.
That's internalization. It happens through repetitive trial and error and learning by doing. The new explicit knowledge, once it's been practiced over and over, gets transformed back into an even deeper, more refined form of personal tacit knowledge. The result of this whole third phase is an autonomous, highly skilled specialist.
Which brings us to the final, most ambitious stage, entering, or new, where that specialist becomes the ultimate value creator.
Phase 4. Entering. New internalization valor creato. This is the post-SEI stage, the true culmination of the whole process. And the key here is to rigorously differentiate the operational specialist, the functionatis spiritulo, from the true value creator, the valor creato.
What is that difference? If the operational specialist is already highly skilled and autonomous, what is the value creator doing that's fundamentally different?
It connects directly back to Marx's theory of commodity value. The functionatis spiritulo has the skills and knowledge to create a product with high use value. It has qualitative utility. It's something that works really well. Yeah.
But
the valor creato is something more. The critical business acumen. We're talking management, sales, marketing, finance. The skills to commercialize that knowledge and manifest its exchange value, its monetary worth in the market.
So the specialist is a phenomenal craftsperson, but the value creator is a craftsperson and an entrepreneur who knows how to package, market, and price that skill.
That's it exactly. The Valor Crento is the one who dares to enter the real world of business and transform potential value into realized monetary value. Without that commercial skill, so many great inventions and newly acquired skills just remain uncommercialized, and therefore they remain socially unrecognized.
And that highlights a massive institutional gap. Practical knowledge gained through this kind of process is so often unrecognized and just devalued by traditional employers or education systems.
And that's where policy has to step in right away. The policy recommendations focus on fixing this by implementing systems to visualize and certify practical skills, things like micro-credentialing and practice-based accreditation. This enhances the social recognition of that expertise and empowers the Valor Crane to demand market-appropriate prices for their skills.
Beyond this whole learning framework, the authors are really clear that we can't wait for this four-phase system to be perfectly implemented. They suggest some immediate policy changes to stabilize youth employment, especially in the gig economy.
Yes, they outlined 4 crucial immediate steps to combat the exploitation in platform capitalism. First, implement minimum wage standards in wage guarantee systems. This is fundamental for stability, especially for low-skilled gig workers who have no pricing power because of the algorithm. They point to things like Singapore's Platform Workers Bill and the EU's Platform Work Directive as good models to look at.
Secondly, they say we have to address those restrictive legal definitions of employment status.
They strongly recommend tackling that binary of employee versus independent contractor. The goal is to introduce intermediate legal categories, something like the UK's worker status. This provides limited but essential rights like minimum rest periods or injury compensation without requiring full employment status. It stops the platforms from completely externalizing all the risk.
Third, a focus on platform regulation and transparency.
Governments must enforce radical transparency in algorithm management. These algorithms control pay, who gets what job, the ratings. Workers need a clear view into how these mechanisms work to make sure they aren't being unfairly penalized. This is a core part of recent EU legislation.
And finally, strengthening collective worker power, even for the self-employed.
Extend collective bargaining rights to them. As the Malaysian case showed so clearly, collective action is currently crippled by the lack of institutional support and legal recognition. Fostering bargaining power through professional associations is vital for restoring workers' self-determination against these dominant risk-avoidant platforms. These immediate steps, combined with the long-term vision of the neo-apprenticeship, they form the path forward.
This has been a remarkably detailed and I think really structured look at a global issue that is just. It's shaping the future of work for everyone. So, to synthesize our deep dive, we started with macro theory and found that the empirical evidence completely debunks the law of one unemployment rate. It proves a structural and persistent disadvantage for young workers, especially teenagers, whose unemployment issues do not fix themselves, resulting in permanent starring.
We then connected that structural fragility to the rise of platform capitalism, this accumulation regime that uses digital tools and legal ambiguity to strategically exploit young workers across the entire skill spectrum. Whether you're a Malaysian delivery rider dealing with emotional labor or a high-skilled Thai freelancer struggling with occupational loneliness and the burden of self-insurance, that flexibility so often comes completely tethered to institutional exclusion and psychological stress.
And the proposed solution is this holistic reconstruction of the learning trajectory, the neo-apprenticeship scheme. This framework, based on that Kajita no Naka synthesis, charts a path from the initial opening of access and mindset through the core awakening where you become an autonomous specialist, the funccianta spiritulo, all the way to the final entering where you become a valor crento, someone who possesses both the use value and the commercialized exchange value of their skills.
And the overarching implication here is profound. Resolving youth employment issues demands that we view gig work not as just some temporary fix for the economy or a source of cheap labor, but as future-oriented employment that has to fundamentally ensure dignity and stability. Reconstructing this learning pathway is absolutely crucial for transforming young people from vulnerable resources into autonomous, socially recognized agents.
But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the final provocative thought from the source material for you to consider as you finish this deep dive. The authors note that the most important phase of this whole neo-apprenticeship is the opening, that very first step. Because it's the phase that enables young people to discover their boundless potential and to believe that they can achieve anything.
So if the institutional structures, The state, the education system, the regulatory framework, if they fail to even provide that initial access and that framework for self-discovery, if they fail to foster that sense of faith and agency in a young person's own life force, then how can society ever truly build a productive and dynamic future? The real, deeper work, perhaps, isn't just about fixing the market mechanics and the algorithms. It's about restoring a young person's belief in their own agency and their own worth within a system that should be designed for their success.